The plans that I've read, and it's been about 100 in the English-speaking world, 8,000 pages, they are unsure whether we need to be able to stay put for 36, 72 hours, 5 days, or 7 days.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Allan Bonner, Urban Crisis Planning Manager. Welcome to the show, Allan.
Thank you for having me.
Allan, the four biggest cities in BC, how prepared are they to face a crisis like a flood, a major fire, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption just across the border from Mount Baker? Vancouver, Surrey, Richmond, Burnaby, how ready are those emergency personnel set to go to protect all of us?
Well, the good news is they're about average, and the bad news is that average is not good enough. The bright spot is a linkage in Richmond's plan to a provincial document on personal preparedness and some creative mentions of designated disaster routes and things like that. But in the overview is that plans have printing problems, navigation problems, blank pages, appendices that don't exist. Many are so old they're actually in violation of the laws and statutes and presidential orders in the U.S. And I used to live at the bottom of Gallardi Way on Lougheed Highway, and I lived in Vancouver twice, and I think of the dangers of earthquakes, for which we're not prepared, and you mentioned volcanic eruption, and there's also terrorism and so on. It's a busy port. There are drugs that are smuggled in. So I'm not encouraged by what I'm reading.
Well, you'd think every basic city would have a basic plan. If we have a major fire, you put people on buses, you move them to this evacuation area. Do they not have that?
No, they have aspirational statements that say such things as evacuation is an important aspect of emergency preparedness and it must be planned well, and the decision to call for an evacuation is not made lightly, and on and on and on it goes. But what I want to know is how many bus drivers are there? How many buses are there? In a flu pandemic, 30% of the bus drivers will probably be either sick or pretending to be sick. In some incidents, you won't be able to get fuel. And I want to know, if you did load up all those buses, where do they all go? Do they go to Chilliwack? Do they go to Hope? Is there anything there? Are there services? Are there food? What's at the end of the SkyTrain? So there are a lot of aspirational statements and sort of mission, vision, value statements, but not the kind of hard data that I would want my mother to know. Go here, you will get picked up, you will get taken somewhere else, here's what to carry with you, and so on and so forth. Burnaby takes a little stab at 26 steps to preparedness, listing some historical events and how to prepare for things. But it's got poor maps and poor printing and a PowerPoint on it. Surrey doesn't actually have a plan. It says it has trained facilitators to help in making neighborhood plans, and that's good. A big pet plan, which is very good news because pets are very important to people and they will actually endanger themselves for their pets. So I would like to see, in short, Jim, a lot more specificity and clear direction on exactly what to do.
Yes. Now, a pilot, when his plane has trouble, has a set checklist. If I've lost a left engine, a right engine, I do this. If I've lost cabin pressure, I do that. Do municipalities typically have a checklist where I have a flood, we do these 10 things first?
In short, no. There are some valiant stabs at that, such as the 26 steps to preparation in Burnaby, or what to do when there is a flood. But what I'd rather see is what to do to prevent a flood. So, for example, you may not actually be able to prevent a flood, but about 40 to 50% of the Fraser Valley was underwater in a big flood in the 40s or 50s. I would mandate and communicate about raising your hot water tank in your basement, raising the washer dryer in your basement, any other appliances, TV sets, what have you. For seismic events, making sure that the wood frame home is actually bolted to the foundation. Many of them aren't. You can stiffen up a home with, if it's a wood frame home, a diagonal board across the outside or something that's attractive to stiffen it up. So I'm not seeing the checklist on how to prepare or the checklist to what to do. Let me capitalize on your excellent analogy about the pilot. There are 150 things to do when you have fire in the cockpit, and the crew of the Swiss airplane that crashed off Peggy's Cove were following those directives. Another plane, which was a courier plane in the U.S., was piloted by a couple of swashbuckling Americans. They said, "To heck with this list," and they just landed. So sometimes the list will save your life, and sometimes it will kill you, but there at least should be a list, and I'm much more in favor of a list of preparedness steps than a list of response steps.
Is it a matter of funding, or is it a matter of will?
Well, at least one plan has a list of things to do that are no cost. You can introduce yourself to your neighbors and find out who's a retired nurse or has a first aid course or owns a chainsaw or a pickup truck or a winch. Some of these mundane things like tools and power saws and a generator are really going to save your life in a crisis. Who has a boat? Who has a canoe? So those things are absolutely no cost, introducing yourself to your neighbors. Very low cost in an apartment building, a co-op, or a condo. Everybody chips in, keeps a little extra non-perishable food and water. So I don't think it's money. I think it is the response community, the emergency response community, not fully deciding what the rules and regulations are of preparedness. The plans that I've read, and it's been about 100 in the English-speaking world, 8,000 pages, they are unsure whether we need to be able to stay put for 36, 72 hours, 5 days, or 7 days. The levels of crises are called 1, 2, 3, with 3 being the worst, except in one city where 1 is the worst. Some cities have 2 levels of crises, 4 levels of crises, 7 levels of response. I mean, if you've got a mutual aid agreement and you bring in people from a neighboring community and you don't even have the same terminology, that's not great. So I think that the emergency response profession, and I know it's taught in a number of great institutions in BC, they have to get their terminology straight first, because you can spend all the money you want, but if you're spending it on different things and different procedures, you're still not going to be communicating well.
Well, I remember in the first hockey riot in Vancouver, we've had the privilege of 2 for losing the Stanley Cup. But in the first one, Vancouver firefighters were tied up handling the rioters, so they called in neighboring Richmond. They had one problem. The Richmond fire hoses did not fit the Vancouver fire hydrants.
Well, that's just inexcusable. It is malpractice. It is a liability issue. I'm actually shocked to hear that. During 9/11, and I said this very carefully on television in New York a month after 9/11, the civilian chain of command should be required to make sure that these people in uniform, fire, police, EMS, have the best kit imaginable, and they do have interoperability. This is absolutely ridiculous. I used to work in a newsroom, as you know. When I worked in the St. John, New Brunswick newsroom, I'd regularly get the Boston Fire Department over my two-way radio. I think it was VHF or something, or UHF. I mean, we have to get serious about this. Not having the same size hose is preposterous. It's like police not having the same caliber of weapon or taser or training or cars, what have you. This is absolutely malpractice.
But here in the Lower Mainland, we have ECOM, which does handle most of the emergency measures communications, but Surrey isn't part of that, and Surrey's the second biggest community in British Columbia because they decided to build their own.
Well, what can I say? Surrey is also one of the fastest growing communities in all of Canada, and I've been through it on the SkyTrain, and the SkyTrain is a wonderful resource. And by the way, SkyTrain can't very well get flooded either, because it's so high off the ground, which is a great asset.
Except downtown where it's a tunnel.
Pardon me?
Except downtown where it's a tunnel, and most of the route from downtown to the airport's a tunnel.
You're right.
Yeah.
But when we build these things, we are building in either risk or redemption, and the elevated portion is nice and safe. But I think that communities not cooperating with each other is nuts. In California, there's a mandated statewide mutual aid agreement between and among all communities, and there are efforts to try to get the same terminology. There's even a presidential directive to have the same terminology. It isn't followed that I can see, but this should be the goal. I'm shocked at that as well.
We'll have more with Allan Bonner right after this.
More and more people are looking to the Internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
In Goddard we trust.
Welcome back. We're speaking to Urban Crisis Planning Manager Allan Bonner. Allan, I know they say that you should be prepared to look after yourself anywhere from, like you said, 3 days to 7 days, have some food and water put aside, and a first aid kit. But who's going to look after you after that period of time? Do they have a plan for that?
Well, that's a great question, and there are, swashbuckling libertarians in the U.S. who say they don't want government stepping in, they don't want federal aid, they don't want federal troops, they don't want. I mean, I think we have a different view in Canada that by virtue of the taxes we pay, we are supposed to get some kind of security and the integrity of borders and health and human services, some basic things like that. By virtue of our citizenship and the taxes we pay. Now, that doesn't mean the individual is off scot-free. I mean, I think that if you go driving around up to Whistler in the middle of a snowstorm in the winter in a business suit to show some visitors the scenery, you are irresponsible. I think that you need to keep certain emergency things in your car: clothing, food, candles, what have you. There is a good list on the Richmond link to the provincial plan. At home, you need to keep, a whistle and a flashlight, and talk to your kids about the fears and have a family plan. Where do you reunite? Some creative ideas in there: bright-colored garbage bags, which can also be used as signals, and how to save water, how to purify water. I mean, this is really good advice, and it's the province, it's not the city, but this is something that I would expect to see. After 7 days, man, if you aren't out of the woods, you are in big trouble, because when you don't have running water, potable water, electricity for 7 days, it gets rough. I mean, I've been without it for weekends, and used to go to remote farms and cottages and so on where roughing it was kind of fun. But if an event goes beyond 7 days, people are in real trouble.
Now, of course, in Canada, it appears that your personal safety depends greatly on who you voted for, because the Conservative Party of Canada, which runs the government, has closed the Kitsilano Coast Guard base, the busiest in Canada. They've shut down the Marine Air Traffic Control Center in Vancouver, the only one of its kind in the world, in the busiest port with air traffic that lands on the water. They've shut down the Marine Rescue Center on Vancouver Island and centralized it. And by the way, the very first weekend that they had the centralized operation going, the radios didn't work. So obviously the federal government doesn't care about British Columbia, and if it has a disaster, what can we do to look after ourselves?
Well, isn't it right that is the weather ship still 200 miles off Vancouver Island, or have they abandoned the weather ship as well?
Well, who knows? Don't forget the scientists.
I don't know, but I know that weather and predicting the weather, which often starts a couple of hundred miles out or a couple of thousand miles or several thousand feet up at the jet stream, this is really important for early warning. The downloading, it's great that the provinces passed the Municipal Act and created cities, because cities aren't mentioned in our Constitution. They have no standing whatsoever. They could be disbanded theoretically any time. It's fine to give cities autonomy. It's fine that the Supreme Court has ruled that with the term subsidiarity, which means that the city is closest to the population and best able to deliver services. That's all fine theoretically. But if they don't have the money, they don't have the skill, they don't have the expertise, and there isn't the leadership, I mean, no municipal politician is going to campaign on trying to make evacuation happen easily. Emergency preparedness simply does not have a constituency. So a long-winded way of getting to the point of your question, perhaps, and saying someone has to be in charge. The city of Vancouver can't be in charge of the city of Kelowna. The city of Kelowna cannot dictate Surrey. As you pointed out, Surrey isn't even in the loop in some of these emergency preparedness things. There is no one that I know in this country, no level of government, no agency, no police, nobody, who is empowered to stop a truck driver on low-heat highway and say, uncouple those bowling balls or toys out of your truck and go hook up to medical supplies at Brentwood Shopping Center and take them to, Coquitlam Road or someplace where they are needed. No one has the authority to do that. The only thing a police officer can do is use moral suasion. There is sometimes empowerment to commandeer private property and what have you, but if people don't know it, they're going to resist. So we really don't have a system to cause proper response to happen. Often people do well, and response agencies do well, police, fire, ambulance, but it is not systematized in my view.
Well, the city of Calgary, it seems to me, responded very well to their flood, and people asked me, will they hold the Calgary Stampede 2 weeks after the flood? And I said, well, having been born in Calgary and raised in Alberta, I said if they have to hold sheets of plywood over their head and let the horses run on that, that's what they'll do, because they're that kind of people. But you can't rely on that kind of a resourcefulness all the time where people work together.
No, I think it's like saying, parents who are listening to your program often say, well, my kid's a good kid and won't get into trouble, won't get into danger. But the fact of the matter is you can't control people who are speeding on the Trans-Canada Highway or the type of driver that your kids take a ride with. There are all kinds of unforeseen circumstances. So depending upon the swashbuckling frontier spirit of Albertans or British Columbians, or, the urbane sophistication of people in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, I mean, it's just a cliche, isn't it? In Coquitlam, for example, right near the water, where flooding can be an issue, there are a series of Q's and A's, which I don't like anyway because they don't usually transmit much, but one of the Q's is, will the city provide sandbags? Good question. The answer is, sand is available from local gravel pits and landscape supply stores. Now, did you hear that?
So you're supposed
will
to
the city provide sandbags? And the answer is, sand is available from local gravel pits and landscape supply stores. It's a non-answer.
Go to Rona and Home Depot and buy some sand.
Well, you don't know whether you have to buy it or they're going to give it to you, and you don't know where you're going to get sandbags, but you suspect the city isn't going to give them to you. If you gave that sort of an answer in high school, someone would say, Jimmy, you're being a silly bugger, answer the question. And lives are at stake, and the city has an obligation to say whether it's going to give out sandbags, not give them out, where do you buy them, where do you buy sand, how much it costs, and so on. Or sandbags are actually outdated. There is a plastic box that you can fill with water, because in a flood you have lots of water, and they're far more stable than sandbags. So I think that the non-answer, the lack of direction, the blank pages in the Coquitlam plan, the reference to using fax machines. Aren't fax machines almost obsolete, Jim?
Who has one?
Well, I don't have one anymore. I mean, people scan and send me things. This is just somebody not having as a high priority fulfilling a legal responsibility to write a plan and update it every year.
Allan, how many of these emergency plans or lack of plans use the word hope?
Well, it's not so much they use the word hope, and I don't have that statistic in my mind, but they certainly do have aspirational statements, which leads me to believe that people are hoping something will happen. They say, people shall prepare in the following way. Building managers will do the following. It is expected that schools will do this, that, and the other thing. There are a bunch of what you'd call weasel words. I mean, if you wrote an essay in high school saying it is expected that schools will be prepared for floods, you said, well, who's expecting this? What is the subject? Who is the subject of that sentence? Did anyone require the schools? Is it actually happening, or is this merely wishful thinking? So I think there is a lot of hope, aspirational statements, wishful thinking, but not actual hard information about what to do. Now, let me give you some examples where people have actually done the kind of things that I think are far more valuable. Boston has about a 400-page climate change report from a mayor's task force. Any of your listeners can download it, see the latest study on climate change. Boston's in a similar spot as much of Vancouver. Going to be shoreline erosion, sea level rising, it's going to have a huge effect. They have built one park that has drainage in it and is actually designed to combat flooding and sea level rising. It's great. Houston has benchmarks for the number of portable toilets and hand washing stations you need during an evacuation or sheltering in place. Kansas City, it recognizes the obvious. Mutual aid resources will be minimal, they say. Kansas City has a thing called Plan Bulldozer. Sounds like an old kid's cartoon from Saturday morning, doesn't it? Plan Bulldozer is a list of private sector heavy equipment operators who are willing to rent or use their equipment during an emergency. That's what we need. If I were at North Road on the Burnaby-Coquitlam border, I would want to know where can I get a crane, a bulldozer, a backhoe, a flatbed truck, or a chainsaw. These are things that are needed.
Well, I remember that shopping mall collapse in Ontario where those women were trapped inside. They could have been alive. And they said, well, we have no way to get to them. But they said we needed a crane. Well, I said, nearby, there's a Canadian Armed Forces base where they have tanks. Tanks have other tanks that have cranes built on them. Now, that tank could take a building falling on it and nobody would get hurt, yet they could rip all this stuff away from those women. No one ever even thought of using an armed forces piece of equipment to rescue and save lives.
Well, they also may well have Sikorsky helicopters nearby and all kinds of other great kit, including armored personnel carriers, which you don't need the armor, but anything could fall on them as well. You have a military base in Chilliwack. You have some reference in Richmond to an armored division, which is great. That's one of the rare references to the military I've ever seen in an emergency plan, and congratulations to Richmond. But you're right, there are sources there are resources around that you should inventory, and they are called expanding organizations. The military don't normally save people in collapsed shopping centers, but they can be retooled and retasked to do that. And so can a logging company. They have some heavy equipment. So can snow plows and what have you. They're not trained to do it, and they might injure some people, but at least they could give it a try.
Well, what always amazes me is when I see some natural disaster happen, Kelowna's evacuated because of a fire, and you say, well, where's Ottawa? Where's the armed forces? Where are the federal people? And they'll go, well, they never asked for help, or we didn't know there was a disaster. Has no one in those capital cities turned on their television sets or radios or looked at a Twitter feed and is not aware that there's a natural disaster going on? New Orleans has to be the worst case in the world of, gosh, we didn't know that millions of people were in trouble, and they didn't go to help them for weeks.
Well, Jim, you've raised a very, very important issue, and America is a much more complex situation than Canada. Going back to the Civil War, the use of federal forces in a state is a very controversial matter, and in order to trigger that, you have to have the state governor make a request. The state governor is in charge of the National Guard, who are part-time citizen soldiers, like our reserves, but that's a very complex matter. In Canada, our armed forces are called Aid to the Civil Power, and they are designed to do exactly that. Now, what I think should happen is that given a certain set of circumstances, a response should be automatic. So, for example, if a certain number of centimeters of snow falls on the ground, we bring out snowplows. If more centimeters fall, we bring out more snowplows. If more still fall, we close schools. In big urban areas, probably not in Vancouver, but in eastern places where you get lots of snow, they have snow melting machines that are gigantic things that are run by diesel power, and they're brought out given a certain amount of snowfall. No decision needs to be made. Nobody needs to sit around saying, gee, we've had 3 centimeters of snow just like we had the past 100 years every year. What do you think we should do? The decision is automatic. So given a certain number of people evacuating, a certain percentage of the population, or a certain number of acres on fire, or a certain rise in the water level, I believe that should trigger an automatic response by all the authorities, the federal military, the reserves, etc. And if you called them out too quickly, it's what you call in the civilian response area, get big quickly. and you can always pull them back, but it's hard to catch up if you don't. It also is in keeping with a military concept. You need 3 times the forces to attack than you do to defend. You can defend a house in house-to-house combat in Cyprus, and I've been there, much easier than you can attack it. So get more resources and troops on the ground than you think you need, because you might just need them.
Now, if people did have a plan, you said one of the things that you did find, if there's an evacuation, they're telling everybody pile into your cars. There's just one problem.
Well, there's more than one problem, Jim. Somewhere between 20 and 56% of large American cities feature people who do not own automobiles. New York is the classic case. 56% of New Yorkers don't own automobiles. Now, you and I have both had clunky old cars that are unreliable. So even many people who do own cars have unreliable cars. Is that the problem you were thinking of?
Well, exactly. If there's an evacuation, how do I get out of here if your wife has the only car and she's 45 miles away?
Well, and it gets worse, if I may say. People also take, when I lived in Burnaby, people often had 2 cars, a great big gas guzzler for the family on the weekends, and a little wee car to commute into work. People take all their vehicles. They take their campers. They take their Winnebagos. They tow things. They pack up everything. They try to, there are no services. You can't stop and use the washroom or get water. People think of an evacuation being like a really busy day on the Trans-Canada or the Lougheed Highway. No, it's not. It is, some estimates say it takes 50 hours to evacuate 1 million people. Now, a lot of people will shelter in place, or a lot of people will stay at a cottage, or they'll be away from home. If people are in Point Roberts, they'll stay there. But 50 hours to get rid of 1 million people, I think it's Kansas City estimates it might be able to evacuate its downtown in 4 hours. I mean, this is murder. People are going to be on the side of the road. Cars are going to run out of gas. Fights will break out. And this nonsense about contraflow, where all roads, all lanes go out, is actually, by some studies, more dangerous than the emergency. Does not double capacity, prevents emergency vehicles from coming back in. So we got trouble in an evacuation. We have real trouble.
And we also saw here in Vancouver on the waterfront, a container caught fire. They didn't know the chemicals that were involved. They didn't know if they were deadly, if they were just irritating. They don't even know what's happening on our waterfront. They said, well, we put labels on the container, but what happens when it's ablaze and you can't get close to it?
Well, and by the way, I've done environmental audits of places, and those containers are required to have WHMIS sheets, Workplace Health Management Information Systems. Some facilities have hundreds and hundreds of WHMIS sheets. You couldn't possibly tell which ones are up to date and out of date. By the way, there's a bit of good news in Vancouver. Although the Second Narrows Bridge is not a very effective bridge and has historical problems, you've got a couple of bridges. You've got the C-Bus, SkyTrain. More means of transport would allow for people to at least get across Burrard Inlet, or if you had cable cars like Ski Hills have, like Roosevelt Island has, more and different ways of moving people around that run on gasoline, diesel, electric, what have you. SkyTrain, in my memory, you can hook on another train or two to the SkyTrain and maybe move a few more people. But you have to look at these things. There are some jurisdictions I've looked at where they know the number of buses they have, and they know they have fewer drivers than they have buses. Well, Jim, you and I can't suddenly figure out how to drive a bus, as much as we'd be happy to volunteer. So we need an inventory of retired bus drivers and big truck operators who might be able to help in an emergency.
In Vancouver, of course, Vancouver itself has very expensive real estate, and they have found the emergency responders live across the Fraser River, where the bridges might fall down in an earthquake. So the firefighters and the policemen live outside the city, and the doctors live in West Vancouver, the richest community in Canada, but they're across an inlet where there's 2 bridges that might come down, and a little puddly C-Bus, which can carry 100 people at a time, isn't really going to help them. So the doctors and other emergency responders aren't actually in the city of Vancouver. And what's the plan to get them to work?
That's an interesting problem. New York addressed part of that problem by giving police and fire fighters free, I think they gave them free subway rides if they rode in uniform. So you got a cop in uniform an extra 2 hours a day on the subway, which is pretty creative and clever way of doing things. New York also has subsidized housing for police and fire. Now, Vancouver can't entice its physicians, police, fire, ambulance, EMS people into town with low-cost housing or some other enticement. Somebody just says, I want to live across the Lionsgate Bridge. I want to live in Surrey. That's tough. It's my right. Okay, if you can't entice them in, you're going to have to get helicopters, because if a bridge does go down or there's an accident on the bridge, you're just not going to be able to get the responders into town.
So overall, Allan, how ready is BC, how ready is Canada to face a major disaster?
Well, I'll tell you a quick anecdote. One of the first ever earthquake-proof buildings in Vancouver was built by my father. It was part of the Project 200 that didn't come off. It built one building, foot of Granville Street, 200 Granville Square. It was built on pillars above the railway tracks, because that's all they had the rights to. They didn't have any land. They had the air rights above the railway tracks. It was one of the first ever density transfers. He built it on neoprene pads in sockets. And at the time, they advertised it, if Vancouver's all a bunch of rubble and you can climb across the rubble, you can come and work in your office building. My father laughed at me. He said, we have no idea what neoprene is like when you put hundreds of tons of building on it. And that was in about 1969 or 70. And how would you ever maintain those things with a building sitting on top of it? So even the earthquake-proof building of 1969-70 is in big doubt for me. Vancouver's plan says 60% of the stock was built before seismic guidelines. We've not had a big earthquake in Vancouver, so the buildings are still standing. We've got to stiffen those up. If we haven't stiffened them up, you've answered your own question. We are not prepared to clear up the rubble that those downed buildings will create. What we could do is stiffen them up with extra boards and sinking I-beams in the corners of them and that type of thing. So, long-winded answer, Jim. I am not encouraged by what I see. I'm encouraged by aspects of certain plans, such as I give the province credit for this personal preparedness brochure that Richmond links to, and I give credit to Kansas City about its pets and Boston about climate change. But there isn't a uniform approach and there isn't a comprehensive approach that I've seen. You kind of have to cobble it all together, as I've done. And, happy to have done it, and it was quite a labor of love. But, man, no city employee is going to read 8,000 pages of plans to cobble together the best one that I can see.
Is there a way for a person to check out your report?
Sure. On my webpage, allanbonner.com, ALLANBONNER.com, I have a tab called Safer Cities. And on that are a series of videos that I did during the Boston bombing that talk about a lot of emergency preparedness things. And also under the products tab, they can simply buy the Safer Cities of the Future book that outlines some of these things. If they send me an email, I'm happy to have a conversation by email or telephone with any emergency responder about this topic. In fact, Jim, we sent out email questionnaires, and we called all the emergency managers for 100 cities in North America. Do you know we only received responses from 12? Nobody was even interested in talking about this topic. But if somebody listening to your show is, I will answer emails, I will bundle up the book, I will have a conversation, I'll do whatever it takes to help motivate cities and emergency planners to be safer.
Allan, thank you very much for chatting with us.
My pleasure. Stay safe, Jim. Nice to talk to you again.
I feel like I have to walk around with a helmet, safety vest, life jacket, and parachute all at once.
Goggles as well, Jim.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
My guest has been Urban Crisis Planning Manager Allan Bonner. His website, allanbonner.com. You're listening to the Goddard Report on TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.